This is kind of a weird video for me to make because it's going to be the first video on a medium that I'm not, totally obsessed with. It's also going to be the first video that's not on a game, something that's only game adjacent. Castlevania was a Netflix series that I watched every episode of. I'm a part of this D&D group where our basic schedule is to play half the session, break for food, watch an episode of a show while food, finish the session. Right now we're doing Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, but back then we were doing Castlevania. And Castlevania is a dense show with lots of incredible animation, great world design, and writing that, if I'm being totally honest, varies a little bit more in range in terms of quality than I would like. I'm still not sure if the writing is what kept me from fully loving the show, or if I'm just not the target demographic, but the end result is the same. It's a well-made, well-loved show that I just wasn't totally into. And that's okay. When you're in the world of analyzing media, it's important to also think about the stuff that wasn't made for you, or the stuff you weren't into. Maybe to look at why, maybe to look for standouts and highlights. And that's what this is. This show scaled hard in terms of its visual effects in the later season, but despite those episodes having loads of incredible individual scenes with animation budgets that must be hitting some absolutely bonkers numbers, the standout scene for me is in Season 2, Episode 3. My favorite scene in all of Castlevania, through all of its 4 seasons, is 2.5 minutes of dialogue. Personally, I consider it the most important scene in the whole show for what it's saying underneath itself, and that scene is... Right, it's been 5 years since this episode aired, and I'm still thinking about this scene. Let's do a quick recap for how we got to this point. In 2017, Netflix released the first bits of a brand new series called Castlevania. Named for, and based on, an older game series of the same name, the show, to be said briefly, follows the story of Dracula and his quest to kill all humans, the quest of those humans to stop him, and the fallout and consequence of a power vacuum that large. Castlevania begins with Lisa, a woman who comes to Dracula's castle demanding he teach her about medicine. She figures an immortal vampire in a massive castle, probably has a handful of Biology 101 textbooks lying around somewhere, and she's right. Dracula does make some empty threats, some feigned attempts to get her to leave, stuff like mentioning how he doesn't get many visitors, to which Lisa replies that yeah, it's probably all the corpses you leave on your front lawn. Clean that shit up and get me some tea, you're a terrible host. And so, like any sensible man, when confronted with a strong woman, he promptly falls in love with her. He gives her knowledge of medicine and is chill enough to lend her those bio textbooks for free. What a guy. Lisa's people begin to live longer lives, less consumed by fear, thanks in part to her work and Dracula's knowledge, and it's not long before the two are married. At Lisa's insistence, Dracula takes to the road with the idea of becoming less separated from the world around him, to understand both the world as humans do, as well as those humans. And this is when the Bishop of Targovista burns Lisa at the stake. They call her a witch, and if I'm being totally honest, this is one of the scenes where I just don't quite buy the writing. Regardless of my personal thoughts, this is where the core thesis of the show comes from. Because when Dracula returns from his travels and learns what has happened, he declares war on the city, later expanded to the entire Earth, for what has happened. Why not just kill the bishop who accused Lisa? Because in Dracula's own words, any single person could have stepped forward. Any single person could have said that this is wrong and we shouldn't do it. Any person could have stopped it. And now, the whole world dies because no one single person did anything. At least that's one half of the story. The other half is that the typical hero's journey begins in a different part of the world. A squad of ragtag protagonists form, and they begin moving to stop Dracula's plan. This video is not about them, however, because there's someone else with an issue with Dracula's plan, and he's the other half of this scene. Enter Godbrand, one of the members of Dracula's war council. While not regarded to as particularly bright, he seems to be the only council member that has the foresight to realize that if all of the humans are dead, then there won't be anything for them to eat. Anything nice, anyways. Pig's blood gives him the shits, so he says. And so he approaches Dracula with these concerns. He argues in a roundabout way that maybe they shouldn't kill all humans. Maybe that would be a bad idea, and maybe it would be better to just not do this extinction protocol. And Dracula lists off the reasons why everyone in the council will be just fine after every human has been killed, and Godbrand finally shoots straight.
Except, what if we're not?
Godbrand is not a good person, neither in this scene or in general. Sure, he's advocating that they don't kill all humans, but he's not doing it because he has some moral or ethical pull to be merciful. He's simply concerned with his own well-being, that he doesn't want to starve to death, and he's not willing to just give up his favorite food. Regardless of his reasons, though, he still stands against the murder of all humans here. In his own way, he's still saying, this is wrong, and we shouldn't do it. To which Dracula threatens to kill him. both in passing and directly. And this means everything to me, because underneath all of this projected power, underneath this show of force, there is incredible tragedy. Because this scene is Dracula going so deep into his position of power and his separation from those around him and his overwhelming distance from his original ideology that he doesn't even realize he's just answered the question at the core of his campaign against the humans. Why didn't anyone tell the bishop to stop? Because of this same threat that Godbrand just received when he tried to tell Dracula to stop. It's heavily implied in this scene that while Godbrand is in his prime, Dracula hasn't fed in a while. And even at his lowest, even at Dracula's most vulnerable state, when threats are issued, Godbrand can't even meet his gaze. The power imbalance is that strong. Whatever Dracula says will be, will be. Do not question, do not stray, or else Dracula will—
I slit you up the middle and bite out your heart.
If someone in this crowd told the bishop to stop, do you really think he'd have answered any differently? Later in the show, when Dracula fights with Alucard and he finally understands that
I must already be dead.
I genuinely believe this to be the scene where he dies. Just 2 episodes after this scene with Godbrand, he tells Isaac that while
There was a time that I would relish the details.
he just doesn't care anymore, doesn't have the energy for it. And I believe this is the moment, this is the scene where he tips beyond. Maybe he realizes it all the way at the end. Maybe he doesn't. If he recounted every grain of sand that made up his life, would he know this to be the one? I don't know. What I do know is that this scene is tragic. It shows the inherent toxicity of strength-based power systems, how fear becomes their method of control, how they deny the ability to defy or question, and how doubts cast at the ideology of a singular entity are silenced. Dracula was always the antagonist, but this is the scene where Dracula becomes the villain. This is the scene where Dracula becomes the bishop, and I just can't get it out of my head. To me, this scene is the peak of this show's writing. Dracula answers his own question, he concludes his own thesis, but Dracula isn't there to hear it anymore. It's just the tired, burnt-out thing living in Dracula's shape. And for a show whose writing I just couldn't quite get into, a show whose largest appeal seems to be its flashy, bombastic animation, the fact that it's these 150 seconds of dialogue that are what has sat with me for almost 5 years is an incredible thing.